This session, and I'm now happy to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Theresa Selfa. Dr. Selfa is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. She received her Ph.D. in development sociology from Cornell University and also served as an assistant professor at Kansas State University before assuming her current position at SUNY. Dr. Selfa's research interests include the social, ecological impacts of bioenergy development in both the United States and in Latin America, and sustainable agriculture and food systems. She also served as a member of the National Research Council Committee that examined the renewable fuel standards, and we heard this discussed in several of the previous presentations. She has also examined the socioeconomic impacts of biofuels in rural communities with a primary focus on Kansas and Iowa, and that is actually the title of her presentation today. Thank you so much, Dr. Selfa.
I'd like to join in the thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this workshop, and I'm very excited to see that this body is taking up this topic because I think it's very important. Okay, so just a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk again, some of it will be very familiar from the previous presentations about the emergence of biofuels as an agenda, let's say. Then I'm going to talk about two different research projects. The first one that was just mentioned, I did a research project on impacts of biofuels on rural communities in the U.S. Midwest. And then I've just started last summer with a pilot study looking at sugarcane ethanol production in Colombia, the prospects for certification to address land and water grabs. And we just heard about land grabs in the last presentation, so this is actually a great, it was a great segue to mine and some conclusions. So just to reiterate some of what was mentioned in several presentations, in addition to some of the other reasons why biofuels were being promoted around the world, rural development was certainly one of the reasons in both the developed, advanced industrialized countries as well as in developing countries. And I had just pulled several covers from several publications that came out in, let's say, 2006, 2005, 2006, when this was really emerging as an agenda for really revitalizing rural economies. So in addition to some of the other reasons we've heard a lot about, the climate, purported climate benefits and energy independence, biofuels are being promoted in many countries as an opportunity for rural economic development. And many rural municipal governments, thinking here specifically of the United States, and the Midwest is my focus for this research, gave a lot of tax breaks, created new districts for investment, upgraded infrastructure such as roads and water and sewer plants, all to attract ethanol plants to their locations, to their communities. So this sparked the project that I started called the Biofuels Revolution, Understanding the Impacts of Ethanol Production on Rural Communities in Iowa and Kansas, that was funded by the DOE ELSI program. And we examined the socioeconomic impacts of ethanol production in 6 rural communities in Kansas and Iowa, and focused particularly on community perceptions of economic and environmental costs and benefits of ethanol production. So just quickly, because I'm a social scientist and I'm sure the methods that we use are probably quite different from what most of the other presenters use. So we did 6 community case studies, and we chose our case studies based on a variety of criteria. We wanted to get some variation in the ethanol plant establishment date, the plant size, so we wanted some small plants and some large plants, ownership structure, so some were locally owned and some were non-locally owned, We looked for places where there was either community opposition or support to the plant coming in, and actually there was not very much opposition in Kansas or Iowa. And then the last thing was looking at the availability or scarcity of water in these communities. And I think, as was mentioned yesterday, Iowa's actually a pretty water-rich state, but Kansas, especially as you move farther west, is quite arid. So there was a gradient of water availability. So we worked in several different dimensions. We tracked in the local media the discourse around the plant, looking at community discussions around it. Was the community in support of it? Was there much discussion? We looked at demographic change because especially in the United States Midwest, a lot of communities have lost population, so it was thought that these plants were going to help revitalize and maintain populations. I got a hard time with my clicker. Okay, whoops. We did community surveys of perceived benefits and costs of ethanol and residents' environmental attitudes and behaviors in all the communities. We had over 1,000 surveys completed. And then finally, we did focus groups and in-depth interviews with a variety of stakeholders in all the communities, including farmers, plant workers, plant owners, local government officials, environmental organizations, school administrators, community members, and business owners. And just to give you a quick picture of where our 6 case studies were, really distributed all over the state of Kansas. And just as a side note, 2 of the 4 plants that we studied in Kansas actually one is currently idled because the price of corn was so high last year that it was not feasible for them to run, and one has already gone bankrupt and restructured. So it's not, one of my conclusions is going to be it's not an obvious win-win for rural communities. And this is just a quick snapshot of the demographics of the communities. As you can, and I want to spend a lot of time, but you can see they're all small communities, population. You can also see that most of them have lost population, really since the 1950s, but even in the last decade, as much as 10%. In terms of the percent below the poverty line, there's quite a bit of poverty in these communities. And there's other things like plant capacity, which I said we tried to get some small and some large plants, feedstock. For the most part, it's corn, but some of the plants in Kansas actually run sorghum or milo, and the number of employees. And I think that's always important to see, too, because it's really not, these plants really don't have a lot of direct jobs, 30 jobs. It's a small community, but still 30 jobs is not a lot of jobs. So I just have a few findings that I'm going to show you from the community survey. So overall, this is one of the questions. We asked, overall, how would you rate the impact of the plan on the local quality of life? And essentially, it was, even, that benefits and costs are pretty much even as far as, these are all 6 communities, so this is the summary of all the communities. So nothing too striking here in terms of, the benefits were outstanding or that the costs were really onerous. So as I said, we also did a lot of interviews in addition to the survey to try to dig down into, understanding more about economic benefits and perceptions of economic benefits. We found that the perception of benefit from the ethanol plant actually increased with residents' income and education levels, but that there was sort of this intangible community pride, almost like a kind of a community sort of psychological boost around having an ethanol plant in your community. People talked about how it was a good fit because we're a farming town. So just I put up some representative quotes for some of these points. So in one of the Kansas communities, a school superintendent said, "I think most people are proud that we have an ethanol plant. It's a sign of our community being a little more progressive than the community next door, that we may be rivals, that the ethanol plant is looked at as kind of a feather in our cap." So even if They personally were not benefiting from the ethanol plant. I think a lot of these communities initially felt that it gave them sort of a boost because they had decades of out-migration, not a lot of economic growth. So they felt like we're on the right track. We're starting to grow again. But then we also had some open-ended comments on the survey, just asking people, what are your impressions of the plant? So these are the positive comments. Okay, it smells and smokes, but any job in this town is better than none. We're glad to have it, especially with several communities losing jobs in Kansas, Western Kansas. We love it, we support it. I think most people like having it here. We did get more positive than negative comments, open-ended comments on the survey, but here are some of the negative comments. It may soon close, and we will be burdened with a tax load, as we already are, and we had no say about it. There was no election. We done this, now you taxpayers eat it. Very frustrated with the increase in traffic to and from the plant, and a disappointment in the addition of jobs that are not available to local residents. Most people have no idea who runs the plant and who benefits from it locally. The only problem I have is that why should our county go into debt to build a paved road to the plant to make the investors money? And then this final one, I think we heard this in several communities. The downside that scares me to death is that we've built a lot of things around this plant, so have other towns, and at the stroke of the market could shut them all down. This upheaval cause would be tremendous, a lot of money being lost in investment. So there was definitely a lot of concern around what's the future, is this really sustainable, is it economically feasible? So then moving on, we asked about impacts. Has the ethanol plant had any of the following impacts? So in descending order, and this again is all 6 communities, the highest percentage thought there was a change in the crops planted by farmers. Traffic congestion had increased, that was a concern. Also roads were showing wear. Local foods prices have increased. Now, we were doing this survey between 2008 and 2009, so it's kind of at the time when there was a big concern over the food versus fuel, but in these communities that had not really, it had not sort of trickled down to a sense that there were food price increases there. And then other impacts, generated noticeable odors, water resources have been diverted from other important needs, increased air pollution, and a decrease in the overall quality of environment. And then going down, increased health problems and water pollution were certainly less concerning. And what intrigued us was why residents would identify particular problems, such as water resources have been diverted or odors, but then they didn't really translate that into an overall decrease in the quality of the environment. So what we saw was that there were local specific environmental issues that were salient, especially water scarcity in Western Kansas, but they didn't translate into more general environmental concerns. And here's just another representative quote. A city official said, and this is in Kansas, I would say water is a concern. There's always a concern, especially in Western Kansas, where we have a lot of drought, that we are using a resource that might not come back to us without rain. So I'd say that water usage and consumption is always a big concern. So it was somewhat paradoxical, we thought, that although the residents mentioned specific environmental concerns, the odors, water scarcity, air pollution, they did not seem to be overly concerned about a decline in their local environmental quality. And we looked into that with our interviews, and what we found is that other interviews suggested that relative to the other industries in these communities, which in Iowa and Kansas, the other industries in rural areas are feedlots, oil refineries, meat packing plants, that actually the ethanol industry seemed pretty benign to these residents. And additionally, that many rural communities are really desperate for any kind of economic growth. So that plays into them competing against each other to draw plants to their town, despite relatively few direct jobs. And what, in the future, or later became a lot of instability in the industry due to farm prices. So then conclusions about this project, and then I'm going to move on to talk about the project in Colombia, that state and local governments have incentivized ethanol production in rural communities. And certainly the new market for corn has benefited some farmers, but it's also led to intensification of production with some negative environmental impacts, which we heard a lot about yesterday with especially water. There's really a small number of direct jobs. And more recently, some of the ethanol plants have closed or idled due to market instabilities, and investors and local governments are being left with the debts. So then I want to move on quickly to looking at Latin America. I was also asked to speak about community impacts or social impacts of biofuels in Latin America. And I'm just starting on a new project, and last summer did a pilot research project with a graduate student. So we're looking at sugarcane ethanol production in Colombia, and also the potential for certification of Bonsucro, which is the certification for sugarcane, to address water and land grabs, which we just heard about from the previous speaker. Land grabs has been a big concern. So again, we see there's been a dramatic growth in biofuel production in Latin America in the last 5 to 10 years. There's been a really key role played by the governments in terms of setting production mandates. Also, the European Union Renewable Energy Directive targets sugarcane, as does U.S. ethanol, as an advanced biofuel, so that certainly triggered further interest in production for export. And also has driven the expansion of standards and certification systems, which we heard a little bit about yesterday, the palm renewable roundtable, on sustainable palm oil, sustainable biofuels, soy, and Bonsucro. So quickly, there has been a lot of attention to biofuels driving land grabs around the world, and I'm glad that the last speaker also rightly pointed out that it's not just biofuels, it's also agriculture. So when we talk about land grabs, the traditional meaning of it is that it's a foreign investor coming in and buying up large tracts of land. And in the case of sugarcane and palm oil are what are called flex crops by some scholars, such that they can either be used as a food crop or as a fuel crop, depending on markets and incentives, et cetera. But importantly, there's regional differentiation in terms of the land grab. So in Latin American Caribbean and the Caribbean region, we see a different situation than maybe in Malaysia or in Africa, where Africa particularly, there's been a lot of attention to land grabs. In Latin America, there's really been a central role played by the national state in promoting biofuels, a critical role of domestic elites, so it's not so much outside foreign investors coming in, it's really driven more by the domestic elites. And it doesn't always result in the expulsion of people, as in a lot of the high-profile land grabs we've heard about. So in Colombia, Colombia is one of the larger producers of Latin America after Brazil for sugarcane ethanol, and it's just starting to move into palm oil production. Again, the biofuel production has been driven by production and use mandates, but they have not actually been met yet in Colombia. So while Colombia hopes to become an exporter, they haven't actually met their domestic use mandates yet. And it's also seen as a major strategy for rural development in the context of Colombia being a country with a lot of armed conflict in rural areas. So it's actually a strategy to find a new activity in these rural areas with the goal to become an exporter of biofuels. But just for those of you who might know or might not know, Latin America, Colombia have had a long history of entrenched unequal land distribution patterns. So our pilot study was in the Valley do Cauca in southwest Colombia. My graduate student did exploratory interviews with stakeholders in the sugarcane and ethanol industries, farmers, activists, government officials, industry associations, refineries, agronomists. Just a quick picture of where we are. So the Valle do Cauca has actually been a long-standing sugarcane production region with highly unequal land distribution. And importantly, I think, this area requires irrigation. This sugarcane, as opposed to Brazil, which does not require irrigation. So it really relies on cheap irrigation that's being provided by the government as well. And we've seen a pretty dramatic growth in sugarcane, although there has been sugarcane there, but it's really pushed out in the last decade or so, the remaining kind of food and other cash crops. So who's benefiting from biofuels policies? Certainly the rhetoric has been that it's a rural development strategy, but what we found in our research is that it's really privileging the large producers, and it's in fact just reinforcing land inequities through tax exemptions, access to loan, exports, access to cheap and plentiful irrigation water that we found in interviews was really to the detriment of community users, and also increasing water pollution from intensified sugarcane production. And then, so where does Bonsucro certification come in? So, as we heard a little bit yesterday about the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, there are different certification initiatives that are emerging to certify for sustainability biofuels. So Colombia has become interested in joining Bonsucro in particular, so it can access the European Union markets. And also, we heard in interviews to demonstrate social responsibility at the national level, and with the idea that they want to try to avoid more conflict with local communities, especially around water issues and health issues related to sugarcane burning, because they also burn the sugarcane there. So Bonsucro has a number of principles to address land grab issues as well as environmental issues, and I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of the principles, but because I don't have time to go any further into it. But Bonsucro is really designed to address this classical land grab scenario, not really what's going on in Latin America, because in Latin America, to just say, as in the Bonsucro principle, you need to obey local land use laws, it's somewhat redundant, because most land transactions are actually occurring illegally, and it also really ignores the really central role that the government has played in perpetuating the inequitable land distribution. So it doesn't really address land reform issues or land restitution issues or the issues of violence, which are pretty prominent. Then another principle we looked at was Bonsucro's prospects for addressing water grabs. So as I said, you can see in this table, sugarcane this is in the Valle do Cauca, is getting 64% of the surface water and 88% of the aquifers water is going towards sugarcane, and even there's hardly any water going towards other agriculture, and very small percentages going to other users. And so when we interviewed an agricultural researcher, he said, the municipalities which depend on the underground water really suffer in the dry season because of water, he said, being robbed by the sugar industry, and really with the license, or with the approval of the government agency, the regional authority there, CVC. There's restrictions on water use, but we all know that the management is corrupt. They're co-opted by the sugar mills. And interestingly enough, he said, I have the impression that that ethanol was necessary to justify the pumping because it's very expensive. I'm almost done. So basically, he's suggesting that now that the sugar is going towards the ethanol market, that it's even providing greater justification for why the sugar industry should be using all that water. So summary then. So biofuels, I would say, are not an overwhelming win-win for rural communities, so they may be for some, especially large producers. National, state, and local governments have promoted the expansion of biofuels industries, but there has been less attention to social, environmental, and economic costs to communities. Government has exercised limited oversight in terms of environmental and socioeconomic externalities. And finally, corn and sugarcane ethanol production are really reinforcing and extending land use patterns and agricultural practices which correspond to negative environmental impacts and social inequalities. And I'd just like to acknowledge the funding for the research in Kansas and Iowa is from the Department of Energy under the LC program, and I would like to thank my collaborators on the project. And then just one mention is that I'm involved in 2 more projects that are interdisciplinary biofuels grants, one focused on the northeastern United States, woody warm season biomass, and the other one looking at sustainability, ecosystem service, and bioenergy development across the Americas. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was great talk, Dr. Selfa. Very, I'm sure, generating quite a few questions. And I love the stress on the need for interdisciplinary work to address these very complex issues.